Her name was Sandy Denny. Almost nobody knows it. She had one of the most extraordinary voices in the history of British music. A voice so clear, so luminous, so completely its own thing that Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin called it the most beautiful he had ever heard. She is the only guest vocalist who has ever appeared on a Led Zeppelin album. She wrote "Who Knows Where the Time Goes" when she was 19 years old. It has since been covered by Nina Simone, Cat Power, and Judy Collins, among dozens of others. It is now considered a classic of the 20th century. She was described by her bandmates at Fairport Convention as standing out from every other musician they auditioned like a clean glass in a sink full of dirty dishes. She helped invent British folk rock, an entire genre that would go on to influence artists from Kate Bush to Mumford & Sons. She died on April 21st, 1978. She was 31 years old. She fell down a staircase. This is the story of Sandy Denny, the voice nobody heard, the songs nobody credited, the life that ended before anyone understood what it had been. Alexandra Elaine McLean. Denny was born on January 6, 1947, in Wimbledon, London. She grew up in a middle-class family. Her father was a civil engineer in the kind of comfortable South London suburb that does not tend to produce rock and roll legends. She began singing young. Her voice was recognizable immediately as something out of the ordinary, a purity and a clarity that did not seem to have been taught, that sat in her throat as naturally as breathing. She studied at Kingston College of Art, then at the London Hospital as a trainee nurse. Neither path held her. Music was the only thing that felt necessary. By 1966, she was performing in the London folk club circuit, the small, intimate rooms in Soho and Fulham and Notting Hill, where the British folk revival was happening in the evenings, largely unknown to anyone who wasn't already in it. It was in these clubs that she wrote "Who Knows Where the Time Goes." She was 19 years old. The song is about the birds flying south for winter and what it means that time moves in one direction and never comes back. It is ostensibly simple. A verse, a chorus, a single quiet observation about the nature of things. It is in practice one of the most perfectly realized songs ever written, the kind of thing that sounds obvious only because it has been done so well. A recording of her singing it reached Judy Collins, the American folk star who had an ear for material as sharp as anyone's in the business. Collins was so struck by the song that she recorded it before Sandy had released her own version. She made it the title track of her 1968 album. Sandy Denny became internationally known as a songwriter before she was widely known as a singer. Her own definitive recording with Fairport Convention on the 1969 album Unheard remained the version against which all others are measured. Sandy Denny wrote "Who Knows Where the Time Goes" at 19, before anyone knew who she was. When did you first hear it, and did you know who wrote it? In May 1968, Fairport Convention were auditioning for a new singer. They were a young band from North London, Richard Thompson on guitar, Ashley Hutchings on bass, Simon Nicol on rhythm guitar, Martin Lamble on drums, Ian Matthews as vocalist. They were playing a mixture of West Coast American covers and early original material. They were good. They were not yet extraordinary. Sandy Denny walked into the audition and changed that. Simon Nicol later described the moment. The other auditionees had been competent, some of them talented. Sandy stood out from them like a clean glass in a sink full of dirty dishes. She joined the band. What followed was one of the most compressed periods of creative achievement in British music history. In just over a year, Sandy and Fairport Convention made 3 albums: What We Did on Our Holidays, Unheard, and Liege and Leaf. The third of these, Liège and Leaf, is still considered the most important British folk rock album ever recorded. It took traditional English music, the songs that had been passed down in fragments for centuries, and made them electric, urgent, alive in a way they had never quite been before. Sandy's voice was the instrument around which everything else was built. Richard Thompson's guitar could do extraordinary things, but it was Sandy's voice that gave the band its identity. That quality of something ancient being sung in the present tense. In May 1969, tragedy arrived before the work was complete. The Fairport van crashed on the M1 motorway, returning from a gig in Birmingham. Drummer Martin Lamble, just 19 years old, was killed. Richard Thompson's girlfriend Jeannie Franklin was also killed. Sandy had not been in the van that night. She had traveled home separately, but the crash left her, as it left all of them, weighed down by a grief and a survivor's guilt that never fully lifted. By December 1969, Sandy had left Fairport Convention. She had been there for 18 months. In those 18 months, she had helped create a genre. Sandy was with Fairport Convention for just 18 months. In that time, they made what many consider the greatest British folk rock album ever recorded. Does the brevity of a creative partnership change how you hear the music? In 1971, Robert Plant called Sandy Denny. Led Zeppelin were recording what would become their fourth album, the untitled record known by four symbols, the record that contains Stairway to Heaven, Black Dog, Rock and Roll, and When the Levee Breaks. For The Battle of Evermore, Plant wanted a duet. He wanted a voice that sounded ancient, British, otherworldly, something that could hold its own against his own extraordinary instrument without being swallowed by it. He asked Sandy Denny. She came to the studio. They recorded the song together. Her voice, cool and luminous where Plant's was ferocious and burning, created something that sounded, as one critic later wrote, like it had been sung in a field in medieval England. She is credited on the album sleeve with a symbol of her own, a three-pointed flower, matching the symbols used for the four members of Led Zeppelin. It was a gesture of creative equality from a band not known for making such gestures. She is the only guest vocalist who has ever appeared on a Led Zeppelin album. Led Zeppelin 4 has sold over 37 million copies. Plant said years later that Sandy Denny had the most beautiful voice he had ever heard. He said, "I was honored that she consented to sing with me. She was the most important female voice in British folk, in my view. What she had was the ability to make something ancient sound present, and that is very rare." Most people who have listened to Led Zeppelin 4 have never looked up who sings beside Robert Plant on The Battle of Evermore. Her name was Sandy Denny. Sandy Denny sang on one of the best-selling albums in history, and almost nobody knows it. Have you ever listened to The Battle of Evermore knowing it was her? After leaving Fairport Convention, Sandy had formed a short-lived band called Fotheringay with her partner and later husband, Trevor Lucas, an Australian folk musician. Fotheringay made one album, which is now considered a quiet masterpiece, before dissolving in 1970. Sandy's solo career that followed was both brilliant and troubled. 4 albums of increasing sophistication and originality, made against a backdrop of growing anxiety, self-doubt, and a relationship with alcohol that was becoming something more than social. Those who worked with her described a woman whose talent was enormous and whose confidence in that talent was fragile. Someone who needed constant reassurance from the very people her talent far exceeded. She rejoined Fairport Convention briefly in 1974. The magic of the late 1960s sessions did not reappear. Poor live performances and an indifferent album, Rising for the Moon, led to her and Trevor Lucas both leaving the band in December 1975. Her final solo album, Rendezvous, was released in 1977. It is considered by many who have heard it to be her finest work. More assured, more emotionally direct than anything she had made before. On July 12, 1977, she gave birth to her daughter Georgia. Her last public concert was on November 27, 1977, at the Royalty Theatre in London. It was later released as Gold Dust, live at the Royalty. Those who were there described a performance of extraordinary power. Nobody in the audience knew it was the last one. Sandy's last concert, recorded and later released, is considered one of her finest. Nobody in the audience knew it was the last one. Does knowing that change the way you'd listen to a live recording? In late March 1978, Sandy was on holiday in Cornwall with her parents and baby Georgia. She fell down a staircase at her parents' house. She hit her head on a concrete floor. It was serious. She was not taken to hospital. A doctor prescribed her Distalgesic, a painkiller that carries a documented risk of fatal interaction with alcohol. Sandy had been drinking heavily for years. In the weeks that followed, her marriage to Trevor Lucas disintegrated. Lucas took their daughter Georgia, then 9 months old, and left for Australia. Sandy asked her friend Miranda Ward if she could stay at her flat in London. She vowed to get help for her headaches, for the drinking, for all of it. On the morning of April 17, 1978, Miranda left for work. She asked a neighbor, John Cole, to look in on Sandy later in the day. Cole arrived at the flat at 3 in the afternoon. He found Sandy Denny unconscious at the foot of the staircase. She was rushed by ambulance to Queen Mary's Hospital in Roehampton, then transferred to Atkinson Morley Hospital in Wimbledon, which specialized in brain injuries. When Trevor Lucas received the news in Australia, he flew back to London immediately. Doctors told him Sandy was effectively brain dead. Her condition would not improve. Sandy Denny died on April 21, 1978, without regaining consciousness. She was 31 years old. Her daughter Georgia was 9 months old. The coroner's report recorded her death as a traumatic midbrain hemorrhage caused by blunt force trauma to the head. Whether the final fall was accidental, or whether a previous injury from Cornwall had made her more vulnerable, or whether the combination of Distalgesic and alcohol had played a role, none of these questions were ever definitively answered. Her funeral took place on April 27, 1978, at Putney Vale Cemetery. After the vicar read Psalm 23, her favorite psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd," a piper played "Flowers of the Forest," a traditional Scottish lament for the fallen. Her headstone reads, "The Lady, Alexandra Eileen McLean Lucas, Sandy Denny, June 1st, 47 to April 21st, 78. Richard Thompson, her bandmate and one of the people who had known her most closely, later wrote a song about her death. He called it, "Did She Jump or Was She Pushed?" Nobody ever answered that question, and perhaps the question itself, like so much of Sandy Denny's life, was beside the point. What mattered was what she had left behind: the songs, the voice, the feeling in every recording that something ancient had briefly agreed to be present tense. She was 31 years old. She had done more in those years than most people do with twice as many. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. We find voices like Sandy Denny's every week. They deserve to be heard.